Good morning, everyone. The Standing Committee on International Trade of the House of Commons has invited the Conference Board of Canada to present its final report of its three-year research project, Mission Possible, Sustainable Prosperity for Canada. The presentation of this report has been touted as a landmark study and provides a blueprint for building a new era of Canadian prosperity. It's timely, given that the committee is studying opportunities and challenges Canadian business face in today's global market. So I'd like to thank Mr. Glenn Hodgson, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist for the Conference Board of Canada, and Mr. Gilles Réaume, Vice President, Public Policy, the Conference Board of Canada. We'll start today with their presentations, a short presentation on their report, and then, of course, we'll go to the usual round of questioning. I'd like to start by thanking you very much, gentlemen, looking forward tremendously to this presentation and to these next two meetings to deal with this really important issue. If you could just go ahead, please.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup aux membres du comité.
Thank you very much to the members of the committee.
We had a roundtable on international trade, and I alluded at that time to the fact that we were publishing a fairly substantive report. And we're now two-thirds of the way through the final publication. So I thought I would start by talking a bit about the context and Volume 1, and my colleague Gilles Réaume will speak to the second volume, dealing with resources. The report is called Mission Possible, Sustainable Prosperity for Canada, a huge topic. And we found the only way we could deal with it would be to divide it basically into three clusters. One dealing with Canada's place in globalization, one dealing with the resource boom and how we can capitalize from the spectacular rise in resource prices that we're experiencing right now, and the third on cities. And our President, Ann Golden, will be presenting that next week. In fact, she'll be giving a speech at the Toronto Board of Trade, releasing the third volume. The first volume is called Mission Possible, Stellar Canadian Performance in the Global Economy. And it really addresses the question of national drift, setting the facts out, and then setting out elements of a strategy to create sustainable prosperity for Canada. I'll just spend a couple of minutes on the core hypothesis. The evidence is very clear. Economists are almost unanimous, effectively unanimous, that Canada right now is a nation that's drifting. It's very hard to see. It's almost imperceptible. But the evidence is clear. I'll give you a couple of examples. Per capita income, we've slid from 5th to 10th place in the OECD over the last 15 years. That's a very slow slide, but you can see it. In terms of productivity performance, over the last 5, 10, 20 years, we slid slowly towards the back of the class. We're now in the bottom third of OECD countries, the rich industrial countries, in terms of annual productivity growth rates. When we compare ourselves to the United States, we now find ourselves at about 83% of U.S. levels of productivity. And of course, that translates into having a smaller automobile in your driveway. The analogy I use is you have a Corolla rather than a Lexus in your driveway. Where it really matters, of course, is because we won't have the capacity, and that's not a free ad for Toyota, by the way. It really translates into whether we can pay for the social goods, the healthcare system, the education system we want, and the retirements we all want as we get older. What's driving that? Two major forces we see. One is a combination of global demographics, aging populations in the industrial world, in Canada and countries like Japan and Italy, combined with young populations and changed economic policies in the emerging world. So all of a sudden, countries like China, India, Brazil have become competitors and much stronger forces within the global economy. I think in Maclean's magazine I was quoted as calling it a shift in the tectonic plates of the global economy. That's a good analogy because you can see the major structural forces that are creating friction, but are also creating a new world where Asia in particular will be a pole of economic growth for the world economy. The other major force that we see is the changing alignment of how international trade occurs today. I've given it an expression, integrative trade. En français, c'est le commerce d'intégration. But it really is, trade today is driven by investment. More and more, it's business using foreign direct investment to reposition parts of their supply chain around the world. As we've dropped trade barriers over the last 25 years, businesses are now able to reposition elements of their production anywhere in the world where it makes the most sense, and they use foreign investment to do that. Canadian companies have done that to a certain degree, but it really is a question of whether we're keeping pace with the global dynamics. Our report then goes into a number of near-term factors we're going to have to face. We talk about sustainability. In fact, sustainability, the balancing of the environment and the economy, is a theme that passes through all three volumes. And Jill, I know that you had spent quite some time looking at sustainable practices in the resource industry. We talk about global imbalances. The United States in particular has a massive external deficit equal to about $850 billion annually, which means that it needs to attract equally massive savings from the rest of the world to keep itself aligned. Will there be a shock at some point where the United States is brought back into line? We talk about the Doha round, which is stalled right now, and whether we can find the political means to get Doha moving again before the U.S. President's negotiating mandate expires in July of this year. Because if we don't, we are on the front line of a new Congress in the United States that we fear will be protectionist. And because Canada has a trade surplus, we could well be on the front lines of an adjustment in American attitudes. And then lastly, we talk about emerging markets, the competition they're presenting, the fact that China is now, in some months, a bigger exporter to the United States than Canada is. There's been 1 month so far. But 2 or 3 years down the road, that'll become a standard pattern, where we're slowly being displaced by countries like China and the U.S. market. But the flip side is there's tremendous opportunity in those markets. For the first time, there's a middle class of hundreds of millions of people who have purchasing power and the ability to buy things that we produce and we manufacture. So how do we actually take advantage of the structural changes going on in China, India, Brazil, 150 other countries? The balance of the volume then sets out 5 strategies that we think are critical to creating sustainable wealth within Canada. And I'll go through those very quickly. First is the need to embrace productivity and competitiveness, hard word to say, as a national priority, because that's where wealth creation should come from. This is the smartest form of growth, to boost productivity, output per worker. It's not about working harder, it's all about working smarter, finding better ways to combine innovation, technology, creativity to boost wealth within Canada. We then drill into that framework and address a second theme, which I think is arguably the most powerful in the volume. And the theme we've selected is to create a single Canadian market. Our research, through the many, many studies we did under the Canada Project, identified barriers to commerce at the provincial boundaries, misalignment of regulation between the federal and provincial governments, misalignment even within levels of government, barriers to competition, lack of innovation in our industry and in government policy, barriers to tax and infrastructure. So there's a whole array of things that we've done to ourselves to render ourselves less competitive in the world. And you cannot be competitive in a modern global economy unless your firms are able to compete effectively at home by reaching a national market. So a powerful message. I'd be happy to talk about that at length. Third theme for us is address the aging labor force. Find ways to encourage more immigrants and integrate them faster into our workforce. Incent older workers to stay longer. Our whole pension system and employment system was designed for a time of surplus labor. The rules have completely changed. We're now at a point of labor shortage. And if you live in Western Canada, represent constituencies out there, you know exactly what I mean. But that's even emerging in Central Canada and Atlantic Canada. There's now skill shortages across our economy. So how will we find ways to address that? We think through smarter immigration policy, smarter investment in education, focusing on post-secondary and skill development, and ways to keep older workers attached longer. Fourth strategy for us comes directly to the issue of this committee, which is international trade and investment, and the need to have a comprehensive, well-articulated international trade and investment strategy going forward. We'll be quite happy to talk about that in some detail. We've looked at things like reducing barriers to foreign investment, strengthening the border to make it more seamless so that foreign investors don't see the border as a barrier to functioning within North America. Issues such as growing the services exports within our economy. The balkanization of our national economy makes it very hard for services exporters to actually get out there and compete, because they don't have to compete hard enough at home to really be at a competitive level internationally. Ultimately, it comes back to making trade and investment a centerpiece of our national productivity strategy, having a well-articulated plan, which means Canada assuming a leading role, again, within the WTO negotiations. We've allowed ourselves to be pushed really to the side. We've become policy takers rather than policy makers, we believe, at the WTO. We have to reposition ourselves again. But even as that is occurring, we know that there's a risk that Doha will not proceed for 2 or 3 or 5 years. And we can't sit idle in the interim period. So we have to think about deepening our relationship with the United States within NAFTA, both broadening it to expand its coverage and dealing with very difficult things like non-tariff barriers, north-south. alignment between Canada and the United States, and then pursuing other regional and bilateral deals where there's really great potential, thinking about engaging countries like China and India much more deeply on trade. The last of the 5 strategies in Volume 1 is around foreign policy. And we argue that we need to really think about foreign policy as yet another part of a national productivity strategy, which reinforces our trade and investment and all the other elements. And our view is that our foreign policy really needs to proceed along 2 main tracks. Track number 1 is obviously with the United States, our most important relationship by far, something we have to think about every day, but we're not recommending or advising a big bang solution in terms of relationship with the United States. It's more a matter of practical, day-to-day, rules-based engagement with the United States, seeing that they are our greatest friends and allies, but also looking after our own interests in that relationship. But the second track that we believe in very strongly is the need to embrace emerging markets as a core piece of our foreign policy. China, India, Brazil, many others, because they are the second pole of economic growth within the world economy. And by deeper engagement on foreign policy, we can have a better articulated trade and investment policy towards those countries. We cover all of that in a report of about 130 pages. It's hard to get through, frankly. I've read every word multiple times, and it takes about 7 hours if you have the patience. But we'll be putting out an executive summary next week of about 20 pages, which will articulate that more effectively. Now, Gilles, you want to add a few words about your volume now?
Sure. Last week, we released our second volume of the Canada Project called Mission Possible, a Canadian Resources Strategy for the Boom and Beyond. We focused on the rising global demand for natural resources. It comes primarily from Asia, with basically the fast pace in terms of economic growth in China and India. We have population in China with respect to the middle class is 200 million at the moment. We're looking at rising to 400 million by 2010. In India, they have a middle class now about 90 million and growing fast. All these people have higher incomes. They're looking for things that basically we wouldn't think of that they would purchase in the past, including motor vehicles, electric appliances, housing, the various gadgets that we're used to. And all of that requires natural resources and energy. There are some opportunities also within North America with what we're seeing in terms of long-term trends in demographic growth and economic growth, but to a lesser extent. So when we looked at that, we looked at 4 key sectors: forest products, agri-food, mining, and energy. Each have important opportunities, but also have major challenges. I'll just briefly say a few words on each one. Pour les produits forestiers,
For forestry products, the great challenge is the issue of being able to maintain our competitivity on the world scale. Our pulp and paper mills are old and don't have the best equipment. There are mills now in Brazil and other countries where there did not used to be any. Also, those industries are facing costs that are increasing, and the costs are higher than what we see in the other countries. So we need to renew those strategies and renew the forestry sector. When we look at the agricultural sector, the greatest challenge is to be able to open up the sector to world markets. And my colleague Glenn mentioned that we have tariff barriers that exist, and there's a lack of progress in that area. So we can find opportunities for the agricultural sector. If we're going to do so, we're going to have aggressive strategies to open up doors in that area. We also have to increase the level of innovation in the agricultural sector.
One critical thing is that there's great opportunities, but our reserves are declining. We need to boost our exploration activity to an extent that we've never seen before, so that we can open new mines. And there's a number of things that we recommend to bring that forward. On the energy side, we have vast energy resources. The greatest challenges that we're seeing has to do with the environment and dealing with those environments. So what we're suggesting is that there's an opportunity for Canada to basically become a clean energy superpower. And I emphasize the word clean, which means a dual strategy, one of developing that resource, but also developing environmental technologies. Now, that's basically in terms of the four sectors. There's two common themes that come out of it. One has to do with labor shortages. When we're looking at these resource sectors, the workforce on average is older than what we're seeing in other sectors. So the shortage issue that Glenn alluded to is coming faster than what we're seeing in other sectors, and we're already seeing it in the energy side. The second major theme that crosses everything in terms of all our resource sectors has to do with the regulatory complexity, the hurdles that these companies have to go through to get projects approved. And at a time when we have a boom that will not last forever, we're seeing this boom that will exist for maybe 10, 15, 20 years, then it's certainly going to slow down, if not decline. And we're looking at that opportunity, which is not only a time-limited offer, but it's an offer that we won't see get repeated for generations to come, looking at trends and demographics that we're seeing worldwide. So this is a short-term opportunity where we can benefit, and we have to meet the challenges that we've identified in our volume.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Fascinating. We'll go now to questions, starting with the official opposition Liberal Party. Mr. Baines, go ahead, please, 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I want to thank Mr. Hodgson and Mr. Riom for coming in. I wholeheartedly agree with your assessment overall, Mr. Hodgson. I think, in a nutshell, the way I would summarize what you've said is, the essential goal of this entire exercise, I believe, in the reports is really to have a better standard of living, working fewer hours and generating more income per capita. I mean, that's the essence of it, working smarter and being productive. Some say we have to work longer. I disagree with that. We have to work smarter. And I think one of the most important indicators that one can see is a means to judge our success is the average income, which is not keeping pace with the United States, and that gap is widening with other countries as well. And I think that's really a reflection of individual wealth and the inequity that's growing in our society as well between the have and the have-nots. And so I guess two areas that I want your assistance in better understanding is going to be diversification in trade, and secondly, the Canadian common market that you alluded to in your remarks as well. I guess the first question is in your view, the current government of Canada's overseas trade resources, are they limited when compared to other countries? And for instance, we've seen and we've heard that they'll be closing consulate offices, for example, in Milan, in Italy, in Russia, and Japan. Do you think that is the appropriate strategy to promote trade, or do you think we need to open additional offices? And if so, strategically, what would some of the recommendations be, and which market should we focus on? That's my first question, and I guess after you answer that, then I've got a couple other questions as well for you.
All right, let me take a step back and say that I think a well-articulated trade policy basically has three pieces. One, your business has to be ready to go and compete internationally, and that's why we put so much weight on the concept of a single market in Canada. Ending the balkanization, allowing our firms to achieve optimum scale here, so they really have that sharp edge that's needed to compete internationally. Second piece is about market access, and that's what international trade negotiation is all about. Right now, we can see Doha drifting.
Yes.
We've gone, 13 years with NAFTA, and as we articulated in our report, we think NAFTA has effectively matured. There's no more dynamic energy coming out of NAFTA. Firms are not restructuring anymore. So there's a lot of capacity there to both broaden the coverage of NAFTA by including things like services in much more detail, and also deepen it through much greater effort around harmonization. Maybe that's the wrong word, alignment. Harmonization is a little bit scary sometimes politically, but I think you can say alignment of regulatory standards and process without giving up any of our sovereignty, because often we have slightly different standards that achieve exactly the same end. So finding ways to penetrate more deeply with the United States and the integration of North America, and then pursue other markets. The third piece that you're talking about is on the trade and investment promotion side. But that's basically the sales force of a company, and it's perfectly fine to talk about diversification and whether we have the right resources in place for sales. But we want to make sure that we have all three pieces in place, that we actually are building companies that are going to be competitive internationally, that can go out there and win market share based upon high quality products and price, and the issue of market access. When it comes to diversification, we all want to be more diversified, but you can't push a string. And without having this first two pieces, without having more active market access negotiations, let's say, bilaterally, regionally, multilaterally, there's really only so much you can do by mobilizing more resources in the field. So I guess, argue strongly that you really have to look at all three pieces. Clearly, we do 83% of our exports go to the United States. And our trade, frankly, with other parts of the world has not grown for some time now. It's actually fallen considerably with Japan. So arguing for more investment in trade development officers, let's say, on the ground in Japan, without cracking the nut of market access with the Japanese, is probably not going to be a very efficient use of resources. Same thing with Europe, same thing with many other markets. So I would like to put at least as much weight on the export and investment readiness piece and the market access piece as I would on the number of trade commissioners in the field.
No, so how do you think in your understanding, how do our resources, international trade resources and consular services and our trade missions, how do they compare with other countries? And do you believe in the current strategy that's being deployed? You talk about Japan, it's still a very important trading partner in terms of absolute dollars. And we've had a very strong relationship there. Russia is an emerging market with strong GDP forecast of 6.5%, I think, for this upcoming calendar year. So don't you believe, or do you, in your opinion, do you think we have sufficient resources in those markets to promote trade, or do you think we should cut back?
Given how poorly our trade and investment has performed for a number of years now, I think it would be folly to cut back the resources.
Okay.
Clearly, more is required in the right places, based upon strategic analysis, which means, frankly, more in the United States and more in other markets where you see high potential.
Okay, and now going to you talk about emerging markets, you speak at length about China, and I know that we, as a government, we've seen the government over the past year, for instance, there's been issues in terms of the relationships, and now the Minister of Trade has gone there, and the Minister of Finance has gone there. But you talk about simply those visits are at one level important, but there has to be something more comprehensive. You allude to that as well. Can you talk about that? What more can be done? Because simply sending a minister or two once a year is not going to cut it, and we acknowledge that, and there's common understanding. So what more can be done? What more can the government do to really take our relationship with that country, especially China, as one of the most important emerging markets? How can we further strengthen that? And what comprehensive strategy that you're suggesting? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Well, I think the most important first step, as we articulate in our report, is to recognize that emerging markets really deserve a much higher priority within our foreign policy. China, I put India there as well.
Yes.
Brazil, the major economies in the emerging world. We haven't completely ignored them, but they haven't been receiving the same weight over time that we think they deserve going forward. Secondly, I think our future in engaging China, India, Brazil is going to be investment-led. So rather than working on trade promotion and focusing on shipping finished goods from Canada to those countries, I think we have to look at a much deeper integration, which takes you to things like consideration of bilateral arrangements, looking at things that are called FIPAs, Foreign Investment Protection Agreements, for example, looking at all the tools we have, both multilaterally and bilaterally, to engage more deeply. So it really is, unfortunately, there's no easy fix. You have to roll up your sleeves.
Correct.
And really go sector by sector and identify where the opportunities are.
Yeah.
But frankly, I also think that there's a change in mindset required within Canada. Part of the reason why we put so much weight on the concept of a single market is because we have quietly protected much of our economy from international competition. And therefore, they don't have the same imperative, the same urgent need to go out and actively invest in India and China as companies in other countries do. And the protection is very subtle. But we have to really change the mindset where it's not about mercantilist thinking where we protect ourselves at home and think we have a right to go out and trade with everybody in the world. Part of this is opening our own market up to more competition to ensure
that is taking place with the province of British Columbia and Alberta. And I believe now they're also incorporating another province, I believe Saskatchewan, and they're trying to get an additional territory in as well. So that is starting to take place. What leadership can we show at the federal level with the provinces? How do you see that relationship being structured? Obviously, that's their jurisdiction, but what kind of leadership can we show, and where can we help facilitate that process?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. we believe very strongly that what's called the TILMA, the Trade,
Correct.
Investment and Labor Mobility Agreement between BC and Alberta, is effectively a turning point in attitudes in this country. It's very important leadership being shown by two provinces. Frankly, it's extraordinary to think that two provinces in Canada had to sign a free trade agreement to reduce barriers between the two of them. But it's done, it's going into force. You're absolutely right that other provinces are now quite interested in figuring out the benefits from aligning themselves. But what can we do federally?
Correct, yes.
I think we go right back to the Agreement on Internal Trade, which was struck in 1994. One of our studies called Death by 1,000 Paper Cuts sets out all the barriers and points to the small areas of progress we made under the AIT, but we have to go back and re-energize that as a real centerpiece and set much higher targets and have a much more ambitious negotiating strategy on the federal end to try and liberate effectively markets across the country.
Okay, thank you.
We'll go now to the Bloc Québécois. Monsieur Cardin, 7 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen. I'm pleased to meet with you here today, particularly as we've often heard talk about the Conference Board of Canada. I haven't always believed the comments that I've heard, but I recognize the good work you have done. I've seen the first volume here, the second not yet, but you're talking about natural resources. And so we'll certainly have some kind of executive summary, I'm sure, to be able to look at for Volume 2 as well. And I'll need to take a look at that. International trade and Canada's policy in this regard affects or deals with an incalculable number of factors and elements, and clearly you are advocating, as are some of my conservative colleagues, an almost complete liberalization of markets through, in one way, using or eliminating rather supply management, because you believe that this negatively affects our productivity. One of the things you mentioned earlier is a single Canadian market for resources and investments. You talked about the aging of the population as well. Now, you're basing all of this on productivity. And obviously we need to think about that because we're facing fierce competition from around the planet, and also as a way of generating wealth. But I just want to talk a little bit about your philosophy in terms of developing markets and economic growth versus demographic growth, because I don't know which which comes first in a sense. We need to do we want to increase productivity or do we want to increase consumption? You're talking about, for example, China, which has a gigantic population, 200 million, versus our small country. How can we have any common measure between consumption between those two countries? Because we're talking about creating wealth through increased productivity and consumption. But there are several countries you referred to. The level of productivity in Canada has not been good. 100 employees can be replaced by a single machine. It's completely computerized. So, tangibly speaking, what are the recommendations that you are making to the Canadian government? What direction should they be headed in to ensure that Canada will truly be a competitive country? But all of this in light of the time that it will take. So quickly, what is it that you would recommend? I think I'll go back to the issue of demographics to begin with. What we're proposing is not to increase the birth rate in this country. and to try and do that to meet our challenges or to respond to our challenges. What I'm saying is to look at the aging population. These people, when they retire, what I'm saying is how can we encourage those people to remain in the workforce, whether it's part-time or in some other way. The other issue was, the other thing I was saying was in terms of our immigration. How can we better integrate the immigrants into our labor force? That's another strategy that we can adopt. No, but just quickly, for example, when you're talking about immigration, if you're not advocating an increase in the birth rate in Canada or in Quebec, nevertheless, you are advocating an increase in the population through immigration. Well, we are bringing people with skills from other countries to this country, and we could draw more of those people here rather than them going elsewhere. So we should have immigration policies to encourage them to come here, so that they can, and make sure that they can get good jobs and contribute to our economy. So that's a strategy, I think, that is important. The other is the whole issue of training. You know, for example, that we look at adult training, and Canadian employers spend $850 per year per employee, and it's $10,000 or $1,000 in the States. It's $1,200 in Europe. We're not spending enough on that. We should have a strategy for the workforce, and it has to have a training component. Another thing that Glenn didn't mention, but that is important, is our Aboriginal population. We have a young Aboriginal population that is large. However, they haven't completed the studies that they should have to get good jobs. And we have major challenges in the terms of education in that sector. The other thing is for the young Aboriginals who remain on reserves. There are difficulties in integrating these people into the workforce. So that's another element that we have to keep in mind or bear in mind. In terms of investments and access to foreign markets, there's another strategy, is that we need to have access to the skills available abroad. I read somewhere that the investments that we make abroad, for each dollar that we invest abroad, we are told, results in $2 in net. Now, is that, I don't know if that's here in Quebec, but I'd like you to explain that to me. I'm going to allow Glenn to explain that, but the thing is, in the past, we always emphasized trade and said that exports are what we need. But there's a very close link between investments and trade. And what we've seen is that in making investments in another country attracts exports. And perhaps Glenn can explain that to you better. Well, it's probably more effective if I speak English than French.
Based on analysis done at the OECD, at the organization, multilateral organization. When you invest, you're pulling along other services, you're deepening your export, your business penetration with other countries. So there's a multiplier effect created by investment. It's not merely a matter of exporting jobs, although that does happen, but it's a matter of building that part of production into your total business model and making a particular business or a particular sector more competitive. So the analysis the OECD's done, which has been replicated at Export Development Canada, Exportation Development Canada, where I was prior to joining the conference board, shows that for a dollar invested in an industrial country, in a mature country, you probably get a multiplier of about 60 cents, 0.6. So there's a small net effect through creating more trade by deeper engagement. But when you invest the same dollar in an emerging market, you get a much more positive multiplier. We actually cite the EDC analysis that says $2 of future trade for every dollar invested, but in fact, the poorer the country, where the country is less developed, where it has a less sophisticated economic system, financial system, markets are not as well developed, you get a much higher multiplier. For a very low-income country, you might get a multiplier of six times. So $1 invested may create as much as $6 of future trade, two-way trade between the two countries. So that's a huge knock-on effect. That's part of the reason why I personally have been on a bandwagon on this for 5 or 6 years in my research. Why we have to focus a lot more energy, not just on attracting investment to Canada, but on actually facilitating investment outward by our companies, because there is this significant multiplier effect. And that's particularly true at a time where we no longer have labor surpluses, where we now have labor shortages. One way to actually generate wealth in Canada is to encourage our business community to use investment as a way to deepen their penetration of other markets, to make themselves more efficient, to reach other consumers, to make sales from foreign affiliates. But really, c'est le degré d'engagement, d'intégration.
Is to promote integration. And if we want to penetrate foreign markets, if it's not an issue of consumption, and if there's not a direct link with us, well, that person who's going to make the $2 or $6 will be the contractor or the person doing the work. So 1 on 6.
Firm which is trying to compete globally does not make that investment. They may not be protecting any jobs at home. They may be out of business, because this is not a closed system. They're competing head-on every day with firms from around the world that are doing exactly the same thing. And part of the reason you get the multiplier effect is that by becoming more efficient and taking advantage of that integrative trade model, they can probably maintain certain kinds of jobs at home and, in fact, even improve the quality. What we're seeing as you take apart global distribution, the kind of jobs we want to capture in Canada are jobs that are high value, research and development, conceptualization of product, the marketing, the financial services. So increasingly, and frankly, I think this train has already left the station. You know, the United States has lost 20% of its manufacturing employment in the last 10 years. Almost all of it's gone to Asia, to China, to Vietnam, some to India. And yet, American unemployment has actually gone down over that period. There is a fundamental issue on the nature of employment and how we're sharing the gains from globalization. That's a very important issue. And that's something we'll have to think hard about in our social policy design. But it's not as if you can stand against the tide of globalization, because if you resist, you may simply be gone. You know, it may be not a matter of protecting a certain number of jobs within Canada. Those jobs may simply be gone because the firm will close. It'll be gone, and you'll lose 100% of the jobs, rather than trying to find a way to improve the quality of the 2/3 of employment that you can maintain in Canada. And then with the multiplier effect, deeper engagement of trade, we do see it as a net positive. But obviously this is a grand concept. This is not sort of hard reality for a firm in a particular town. That can be very tough. You're absolutely right to have concerns about the consumption effect and the employment effect for a particular employer in a particular jurisdiction.
Merci, Monsieur Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Cardin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of you gentlemen. This is exactly what this committee is looking for, is this type of input. We've been trying to analyze what should be a go-forward position for Canada, a successful go-forward position, and I think everyone in this room knows full well that we're an exporting nation. And if we don't take advantage of what God has given us, then we deserve to fail. So it's this sort of encouragement that these papers of yours are bringing to us, and I hope that we can. I have to admit I haven't read it all myself. It's a long read. I need a long airplane ride to be able to read all of this. But there is some highlights in it that I would like to. And rather than you listening to me talk, I would rather have you explain this integrative trade strategy that you spoke about when we met last fall. Countries specialize in what they produce best through firms shifting elements of production globally, resulting in greater overall wealth. I would like you to elaborate on that. You talk about not only outward foreign direct investment, but inward forward direction, and how that can advantage Canada. Can you elaborate on that for us, please?
I invented the phrasing integrative trade because I was trying to find a simple brand that people could get their heads around, really understand. That reflects what's happened with liberalization of trade over the last, say, 25 to frankly, all the way back to the end of the Second War, which is there's been steady, step-by-step progress. The tariff barriers have come down. That's allowed businesses to reposition parts of their production around the world because they don't face the same added cost of manufacturing something in one country and then shipping it to another. And that's being driven by foreign investment. This is a phenomenon you see in Canada. You can actually trace it. You can trace it, for example, in looking at the foreign share of our exports. It's a hard concept, or I'll flip it around. The Canadian content of our exports has actually fallen very progressively year after year until recently for a long period of time. I think the number is 1990, the Canadian content of our exports in aggregate was about 70% or 71%. Now it's about 65%. Think about the auto industry. The auto industry is probably the most striking example because it is arguably one of the most, if not the most, globally integrated industries in the world. In Canada, we make machine tools, which are then shipped to the United States to make parts, which are then shipped back to Canada to make bigger parts, which are then shipped back to the United States. Pieces of a car can cross the border apparently as many as 7 times before the end product is made. And of course, we're making more than our fair share of end products in Canada. We have a clear advantage in final fabrication in Canada. We're a net exporter of automobiles by about, 1.6 million a year. So that's a clear example of where the auto companies, within an integrated North America, and we've had the Auto Pact since 1965, we chose quite deliberately as a trade policy way back then to try and integrate ourselves into the North American economy. And they use that repositioning of pieces of their whole production chain within North America to create their greatest possible advantage. That's the most striking example of the integrative trade concept. And of course, you have to invest both sides of the line to do that. You may draw parts in from other countries. You might make seat cushions or pieces of glass in Brazil or in Poland and fit it into your supply chain. So that's the new trade paradigm. When I went to grad school and I did my undergrad at the U of Manitoba many years ago, we were taught about trade in end goods. You know, one country was making cotton and one country was making shoes, and you traded them, and you traded based on comparative advantage, which was relative efficiencies. Modern trade is all about trade in inputs. Something like 40% of all global trade now is trade within companies, intra-firm trade. And that's because companies all around the world are looking to gain their competitive advantage by putting pieces of their supply chain wherever it makes the most sense. And our thinking is, as a country that has resources, but what we really have is brain power. We want to position ourselves at the end of the supply chain where we can make the most money by using our brain power. So going forward, as we think about a trade policy, it's wonderful to export coal and unfinished logs, but it's far better to export brain power and to invest in brain power. And that's why so much of our report goes back to human capital, investing more in our education system. So as you think about trade and investment policy, you really have to take all the pieces on board and think about how to make the national economy as competitive as possible and where to make the right kind of investments going forward. One of the things I liked, I'll tell you, in Advantage Canada, but I also liked in the Liberal statement a year earlier, was the emphasis, and that's because the Conference Board frankly doesn't do politics, we try and do policy. It was the emphasis on post-secondary education. And I think the federal government has a really significant role to play going forward in investing far more in post-secondary education, and because human capital is ultimately very portable. So as you think about trade policy, you really have to think about all the pieces and where you want to fit within those supply chains.
I might remind you that in our 2006 budget, we did put a lot of effort and finances towards education, not just in the standard university education, but also in training tradespeople. And we see that as a win, too. That's a shortfall that we've recognized. Another statement that you have made, the federal government should take a strong stand in favor of further trade liberalization in the food industry. And I guess I go back to some of your comments about us taking advantage of what we have and using that as a primary production, us being able to add value to what we export a tremendous amount of out of this country, that being food, whether it's beef or wheat or whatever it may be. And for us, going back to your comments about the WTO, we have so much to gain, but we've got a real concern about how much we have to lose if we don't get an agreement. And we have this issue, and there's no use being shy about it, we have this issue talking about tariffs in Canada. How do we deal with that? Because all parties have said that we want to defend all of our industries. We want to provide the best opportunities we can for all of our industries. How do we as a country, how do we as a government deal with those issues to go forward to provide the best benefit for all Canadians?
The thing, if you go back to the agri-food sector, 80% of our farm income is dependent on exports. Now, it doesn't mean that all sectors, all the farms and food producers are export-oriented, but still there's a large proportion of them that are. If you're looking at it in terms of market access, the biggest challenges that we're facing is more at the higher end, the more processed type foods, the higher quality type foods, where you have tariffs as high as 300%, where you have practices that prevent selling these processed foods. They're willing to buy your raw commodities. So we're missing out on opportunities for producing these higher end products that generates more income, higher wages, etc. So this is why we believe that trade liberalization is key in the agri-food sector. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to win. Not all farmers are going to win out of that strategy. There will be some losers, definitely. But on average, you're going to get a lot more winners than losers. And it's going to be a net gain for Canada. So that's why we believe in that strategy. Now, in terms of when the Doha round stalled, and we can talk about our supply managed farm sectors like eggs, poultry, dairy. If you're looking at that, there was an element that there could be some protection for sensitive sectors. Now, that means, though, that for supply-managed sectors, they would have had less protection than they currently have, but at least they would still have some degree of protection. So it's through these negotiations you can achieve the best deal, but with something in mind, that the greater trade liberalization you can have for that sector, the better off Canada will be.
Can I have a thought on that? I want to go right to supply management because you want straight talk from us today. If we believe that there's particular sectors of the agricultural economy that need support, that need income support, then find a smart way to give them income support. Economists are always worried when we're using the price mechanism as a vehicle to provide income support. I mean, supply management locks prices in well above the world price for particular goods presumably because we want to provide income support to particular classes of farms and particular classes of farm products. But there's got to be a smarter way to do that. Frankly, writing a check, direct income support would be far more efficient, it might be more effective delivery, and would actually strengthen our ability to go to the WTO and become a leader again and be in favor of freer trade on many fronts. You know, we've been effectively pushed aside by Australia within the inner circle of the WTO. There used to be something called the Quad. We've been pushed out the back door because we weren't ready to go and actually articulate a true free trade plan, a true engagement by the federal government, by Canada, in favor of greater free trade internationally. To get back inside, we're going to have to be prepared to make some sacrifices. But they don't have to be absolute sacrifices. Jill's absolutely right. Whenever you change rules, there are winners and there's losers. But you can design public policies that allow the losers to be compensated. And arguably, that's the great challenge of globalization going forward. How do we find ways to ensure that we can look after the losers, to either mitigate or even offset the loss, while the rest of us capture the benefits of greater globalization and liberalization?
Mr. Réaume, you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to add the one point, and you mentioned about the aspect of using other mechanisms to compensate those that would lose out of further trade liberalization, is that with further trade liberalization, you would be generating higher incomes in general in Canada, so higher tax revenue, etc. So that you would have an opportunity actually to do that than would otherwise be the case. So I would say that one has to look at that strategy and have an aggressive strategy towards it, which we haven't seen in the past.
Menzies. Now to the Democratic member of our committee, Mr. Julian.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to follow up before I get to my questions on your comments about about supply management and supporting family farms, because I think it's fair to say Canadians haven't seen much support from their federal government under the previous Liberal government and under the current Conservative government. That is indeed the problem. We saw with the softwood sellout, in fact, that a government was not willing to stand up for Canadian rights. So the difference between the theory you're putting forward and the practice it shows the gulf, I think, between often the considerations here in Ottawa and what is actually happening on Main Street. Thousands of jobs lost because the government wasn't standing up for us on softwood lumber, and potentially farming communities across the country being devastated if our government does not stand up for Canadians on the Canadian Wheat Board and on supply management. There will always be pressure on us to be like the Americans, but the point is Canada has to chart its own course. And most Canadians believe profoundly that our institutions need to be supported and that Canadians have the right to chart our own course. And that is where I would disagree with some of the comments you've made so far. But I wanted to come back to my question. It's around the sustainability section. There is certainly one element within the report that the NDP has been calling for some time, and that is significant new investments in education and training. And we applaud that you have dealt with that in part in your report. But I went to your sustainability section first, of course, because the environment is certainly in the public's mind a major preoccupation, and it's something that is public policy. People involved in public policy we have to take a consideration for. Now, you basically cite the arguments around the environment and sustainability, but there is one interesting comment. You say Canada needs a well-functioning regulatory system. Canada needs a well-functioning regulatory system to protect the public interest and the environment and ensure the public safety. I could not agree more. That is a very cogent statement. However, previously, you mentioned the SPP, the Security and Prosperity Partnership, otherwise known as deep integration, where Canada would be essentially giving up our regulatory power to lower American standards in about 300 different areas. You also mentioned TILMA, which, similar to Chapter 11 in NAFTA, provides investor rights that override the public interest when it comes to the environment and public safety and a whole host of other areas. So I'm wondering how you square what you've recognized, that we need to protect the public interest, we need to protect the environment, we need to ensure public safety, with investment agreements that give rights to investors that override public safety and override the public interest and override the environment. TILMA is very controversial in my province of British Columbia because people are becoming increasingly aware of the details, and essentially it provides the kind of protection to investors that allow them to override the public interest, as we've seen with Chapter 11. How do you square that contradiction? You've recognized the public interest in the environment, but you've also endorsed investment agreements that override that.
I guess fundamentally, I'm not sure that our analysis takes us to the same conclusion that you've reached. I mean, I see the net benefits from freer trade both horizontally across the country and vertically. And we understand the trade-offs that are made, but I don't see the public interest being offended or abused by virtue of greater certainty on investment.
I think the greatest contentious issue in terms of that is to use regulatory measures as a way of protecting an industry. And you can use environmental standards, for example, that are different than, we'll say, the Americans, so that it prevents the American companies to invest unless they adopt these same standards. And you're saying, well, you know, it's not fair in terms of that. When we're looking at that in terms of, when we say protecting the public and the environment is paramount in terms of, and having a very effective and efficient system to do that, a regulatory system, is that what we're seeing now is not a very efficient system. And there's some doubts about whether it's actually effective as well. There's a lot of duplication and overlap that exists between the provinces and the feds, between various federal departments, between various provincial ministries. I mean, there's a lot of red tape. And basically that is creating a problem with respect to our competitiveness, and is not necessarily benefiting the Canadian public nor the environment. So there's a lot of improvement we can do with our regulatory system to start. So basically the message is that we shouldn't sort of say, well, we're just going to streamline the regulations to the expense of public safety and environmental protection. But there's certainly a way of doing it in a much better way than we're currently seeing. And that's basically the issue.
But you understand the public concern around Chapter 11 provisions, the TILMA provisions, and the basic giving away of sovereignty around the SPP. There's not a single area where the Americans are willing to accept higher Canadian standards. It's a simple concession after concession at the bargaining table that is frustrating Canadians. We saw that with the softwood lumber sellout as well. So you can understand why Canadians are worried about these.
Yes, I can understand that for sure.
I'd like to come to another issue. We had on Monday the ambassador from Chile who came and testified before us and talked about the importance of not treating trade in isolation, that in fact what's happened under a much more progressive government in Chile now is that they are taking trade in the economy and on a parallel track in engaging in a very targeted social policy initiative to try to reduce income inequality. So in Canada, of course, we're seeing rising income inequality. We're now at the same stage we were in the 1920s. And in fact, for most Canadian families, their income's actually fallen since 1989, since the first Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement was signed. So are there components within your report, either the current or coming out, that deal with that issue of ensuring that social policy addresses income inequality so that we actually have prosperous communities? And secondly, when we look at the Human Development Index, most of the countries that score at the very top, and that includes the standard of living and the overall quality of life, are social democratic countries. In other words, countries that have not just simply abandoned everything to the market, but integrate social policies, investment in education, as you've mentioned, healthcare, which is a major source of competitive advantage for Canadian companies because we subsidize it, the public healthcare system. So are there parts of your report that deal with those issues, social policy, income inequality, having an overall comprehensive policy so we don't continue going down the same trail that we've gone over the last 15 years, which is more inequality, more poverty, more homelessness, and fewer social programs?
General level or aggregate level, you're absolutely right that some of the countries that are performing best in the world right now are ones which have high levels of taxation, high levels of social investment, high environmental standards. A country like Sweden, for example, it's very interesting since Sweden entered the EU, and I think part of the reason that their productivity has taken off is because of more competition. Sweden's performed very well. They've met their Kyoto targets. They've done marvelous things restructuring their economy on the inside, still pay high taxes, and have far stronger productivity growth and therefore much more rapidly rising incomes than we do in Canada. On the specific, we have a couple of very specific ideas. For example, we were part of the support for the MISWA task force in Toronto, looking at the working poor and the punitively high marginal tax rates that low-income Canadians pay in many provinces. And we focus on that as one of the three areas where we're advising tax reform for productivity. The need to address head-on the high marginal tax rates of low-income Canadians to have a much smarter and smoother transition from social support to paid employment. A very concrete way of addressing that would be through things like working income tax credits or tax benefits. So we point to very specific things to try and address the social impact of liberalization and opening up markets in Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Julian. And we will now go to the second round. 5 minutes, Mr. Temakovsky.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the presenters. Mr. Menzies mentioned earlier that Canada is a nation of exporting nation. If we take that a little deeper and we look at the labor shortages that you mentioned earlier, and you also commented on improving some of the labor shortages by, like most Western countries are really looking at it, is through immigration. If all of these Western countries or emerging markets are also looking at the same issue, I believe we're in the same situation. All of us sharing labor shortages. I was recently in Switzerland, same thing. I was in Colombia, similar situation, so on and so forth. You mentioned smarter immigration. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about smarter immigration.
Well, we have a huge advantage over many other industrial countries in that we've had an active set of values and set of policies towards immigration for a long time. A country like Japan, which has reached and passed zero population growth, doesn't believe in immigration. It gives people one-year work permits and then tries to get them to go home because they have a particular social view. For us, smarter immigration policy would consist of things like offshore recognition of credentials. We pushed for that years ago, 5 years ago, and we were very pleased to see recent announcements that the government is going to establish greater capacity to offshore credential recognition. That's a key piece. We think that the balance between economic and other immigrants, other classes of immigrants, has to be rethought. We need to put more weight on people who are coming here who are going to be direct contributors into our workforce. We clearly need to invest more on things like to find more rapid integration of immigrants into society. Recognizing credentials earlier so people don't have to come and requalify would be an important piece of that. I think there's a particular crying need. There's a short-term need right now, given the acute gaps that exist in Alberta, and I hear about it in Manitoba as well, to be a lot more creative around short-term work permits and almost like guest worker programs, but in a very positive way, actually finding ways to build that into our economic strategy. And it's interesting how we hear about the provinces taking a lot of lead in that right now, where they're actually doing programs trying to match the needs of employers with the available workforce and looking outside the country. So there's a lot of ground to be made at many, many different levels.
How much of a shortage of labor force will we be faced with in the next 10 years? And will we be able to maintain our exporting nation designation, if I may say? Or should we really look at also the other side, which we're not very good at, importing?
If you're looking at the growth in terms of our population and labor force age, it's rapidly declining. And I think Glenn's around 2012, where there's actually, if you're looking at the growth will be occurring from our immigration, not from our natural population. So the net growth in terms of labor force. There's an issue about, you mentioned, and you associated labor shortages with the aspect of being an export nation. I think there's other things that need to happen as well so that we continue to prosper as an export nation. What we refer to in terms of that, there are three components. We've already mentioned about investing in terms of our human capital, training programs, etc. The second has to do with investments in new technologies. We do poorly compared to other countries in terms of that. We don't invest as much. And that's what we call in economics capital intensity. But we're much lower than what we're seeing in other countries, which is affecting our productivity. And the third critical element is a degree of innovation and commercialization that we have in this country, which helps us become more efficient, but also figure out ways of producing higher valued types of products with the resources that we have, our human resources and our machinery and equipment. So there are a lot of other things that we can do to make sure that we continue to prosper.
I sat on the immigration committee for 2 years, and we looked at some of those issues. And one of the terms that came up was a brain drain from other countries and a brain waste in Canada. Are you somewhat concerned about the brain drain of other smaller countries than Canada, and them not being able to function themselves and creating perhaps ghettos around the world?
Well, ultimately, people vote with their feet, and if they don't feel valued within the society where they live, intelligent people will find a way to use whatever skills they have. I'm probably less concerned, frankly, about brain drain from places like India and China, which are the two dominant sources of immigrants now, because they're making such massive investments in education, in growing engineers and skilled people in numbers that far exceed what we could ever use within Canada. But your fundamental point is absolutely right. You have to worry as a matter of sort of fundamental social policy about stripping the best and brightest out of other countries. but often they have a willingness to leave simply because they cannot find a way to use their talent at home.
If I could change to environmental sector, you mentioned that it is an upcoming and emerging sector in Canada, and it is very important for our future. You mentioned also that we would need to seriously look at that and developing it for the future for us to be able to take advantage of global markets. Would you say that research and development is necessary in this area, or what are some of the elements that would be necessary to kick-start this?
Yeah, research and development would be a key element in terms of that. When we looked at the aspect of making Canada a clean energy superpower, on the clean side, there was a number of environmental technologies that need to be developed, and that comes from investing in research and development, but also helping and making sure that we can commercialize these new technologies in Canada, so that we can build an industry that can then export and not only sell in this country. We've had basically in the past missed the shot on a couple of occasions. If you look at the forest product sector, for example, we used to have a lot of R&D. We used to have a manufacturing sector that was selling technologies to the forest products manufacturers. Now we're importing it from the Scandinavian countries. And a lot of that technology we did in terms of research has been licensed to the Scandinavian countries, missing out on the big opportunity of developing an industry in Canada that could have exported to these other countries. I think in terms of on the energy side, we have an opportunity, given our vast energy resources, to also develop an industry that develops those types of technologies so that we can export it worldwide. Because other countries will be facing the same environmental challenges as we are, as they will want to produce and consume that energy.
So it's not too late.
Malkovsky,
No.
your time is more than up. And we will now go to Monsieur André for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hodgson and Mr. Rayon. I always wonder, Mr. Hodgson, you're talking about this integrative trade strategy, but I wonder if that doesn't lead to exclusion, the exclusion of certain categories of individuals, as you have already enumerated, that this international trade and globalization has brought us about has brought about a certain distance with certain sectors, like the manufacturing sectors, and often that has allowed people to cut jobs for people who have less training and less education. I have a lot of questions about this because recently I was at a symposium of Francophone farmers, and they have a lot of difficulties, whether it's in the hog industry or whether it is dealing with wheat, and we're dealing with the American subsidies. People are experiencing great difficulties. And I would also say that the whole issue of supply management hasn't brought about fortunes for these people either. I was in the States recently and was listening to arguments. They're renegotiating their farm bill. And a farmer there told me, to my great surprise, that we also are having financial difficulties, even though they are highly subsidized. They are still experiencing problems as well. And so I believe that agriculture can't be sold and marketed in the same way as other industrial sectors. I think that agriculture has to be dealt with specially, because food, after all, allows us to live. So if we find ourselves completely distanced from our own agricultural sector, it could be a dangerous thing. Now, in what you're saying about trade, also I realize that the rural areas, and I come from one, live from agriculture and manufacturing. Those are the important sectors. And these areas, these regions in the lower St. Lawrence and the Gaspé, and these aren't really remote regions. They're close to the big cities, but they have problems in any case, because everything's related to the big cities, everything's connected to the major urban centers. I'd like to hear what you have to say about this, because you also talked about losers and winners with this new globalization and our ability to help. We don't want to forget about the losers. We see that there's more and more happening in the private sector, even in education. So there's, in the end, is a kind of exclusion. That's what I see in this, is we're more and more disengaged. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Agriculture, because I know you want to. I think you've just touched upon the single hardest question in discussions on globalization, which is how to share the benefits, how to share the proceeds, how to deal with people who are left behind. Very interesting. The Economist magazine, in the most recent edition, has a whole section dealing with winners and losers in globalization, and the challenge of finding public policies that help people get lifted back up, retrained, supported as they adjust, but also the fact that in every country that is touched by globalization, and there's only 2 or 3 that aren't, and we wouldn't want to live in any of those 2 or 3, like Burma or North Korea, there's always a share of the population that's left behind. And coming up with fair and socially just programs to carry those people along, knowing that someone who does not have the basic literacy skills to function in a modern industrial economy probably can't be retrained at 55 to go back to work. And the fact and the reality that people who lose well-paying jobs in manufacturing often end up in services, and their real wage goes way down. They're frankly not taking home as much. They're losers. That is the single hardest question. I think we know as economists that on a net basis, grosso modo, globalization is creating wealth for the world economy. There are more people with higher incomes than there were 25 years ago. That's very clear. But it's equally clear that it's not a perfect equation by any means. And the design of social programs really does matter. Can we re-educate young people so that they can develop skills, so that they can advance themselves? At what point do you simply put someone on social assistance because they're not capable of adapting to fit within the modern economy? But if I have to choose between greater market openness and greater protection, I know which way I'm going. It's towards greater market openness because I can see the net gain for the collective, for society. Do you want to talk particularly about agriculture? Because
But on the issue of food sovereignty, if you will, well, it's not a problem for Canada. We are a net exporter, a significant one. We have areas that can be used for agriculture, and we could do much more than feed our own population. This isn't an issue that really concerns us in Canada, but what's most important is to ensure that the farmers in Canada can make an adequate living. And what's missing there is that with the protections that we don't see necessarily in other countries, that subsidies we see in the States and Europe, is that creates other problems. With free trade on a world level, it will be essential for the agricultural sector of Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Riom. We'll now go to the government side, to Mr. Cannon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation, and appreciate you taking the time from our October meeting and sharing this information, and look forward to the report on the cities as well. The sustainable, prosperous city is important for all Canadians. Looking just specific, some of the comments that have been raised and important about income support and the Human Development Index, and my understanding is that the population of people in the top 20 countries in that index, they're all within the similar life expectancy, within maybe a few weeks, so it's not really much discrepancy. Canada, U.S., Australia included in that top 20, and some of the other initiatives that and challenges we're facing, as we talked about before the meeting. You just flew over BC and saw the devastation of the pine beetle, and you mentioned in your preamble the forest sector is vital for British Columbia. Unfortunately, we were able to, in this committee, come up with a softwood lumber agreement to provide that certainty and stability for the industry to deal with that devastation and provide the employment. Otherwise, we would have been an even worse situation. We've provided over $1.5 billion for agriculture. There's more to come, and dealing with the CASE program. So we have challenges, and we continue to move forward in working with industry, and appreciate your report. Specifically on the U.S.-Canada situation, you mentioned that Canada will continue to be our main trading partner. And I just wanted to say, in your preamble, you talked a little bit about some of the trade barriers. Do you have any particular trade barriers in mind that you see as unnecessary that we could recommend to our committee that we could help foster that more competitive and expansion of our trade?
Well, it's interesting. I know that our colleagues at the Canadian Council of Chief Executives are acting as the sort of secretariat within the North American Competitiveness Council that's been created. And having talked with them, they put on the table two issues on the Canadian side, which they reached independently from us. But I think they're right. They pointed to two things where we have to make progress. One is on non-tariff barriers, which I find insidious. It's quite remarkable how subtle a barrier can be in the design of a regulation or a regulatory process that can keep Canadian businesses out of the United States, and vice versa. So non-tariff barriers, it's a swamp, though, I'll tell you. You get in there trying to identify what particular things you can touch to make change, and it becomes extremely, extremely difficult. The beauty of the world where protection was provided by tariffs is that it was transparent. You could see the price. You could see you were paying 12% more or 300% more for a particular good, and that was the barrier. But now that we've more or less done away with the tariffs, and they still exist, but they're fairly low for the most part, we're starting to discover really how insidious non-tariff barriers are and how hard it's going to be to actually fix that. So that's the one thing. The other is the border and making the border work. And we have not invested adequately in the infrastructure of the border. We haven't really defined the security systems, but also the easy passage for both goods and people to get across the border. We're doing a study right now at the Conference Board in a center we've created on trade and international investment, trying to examine wait times at the border pre and post 9/11 and how businesses had to adapt to that. And we'll be publishing that probably sometime this spring. And I don't know the results yet because we're still in the midst of doing it. But my suspicion is that there's all sorts of subtle costs that have been passed back to business on both sides of the border that have really made the trading relationship much more difficult. So our advice, and it's through our report, is that significantly more investment is required in hard infrastructure, in alignment of security systems, and raising the IQ of the border, making the border a whole lot smarter. Because otherwise we put yet another barrier in the way to attracting investment to Canada to serve the North American market and making it that much harder for our businesses to compete within North America.
Well, thank you, and appreciate that. And Minister Day will be looking forward to that report because he's been working very closely with Americans and trying to streamline that border crossing initiative for tourism and our trade, both sides of the border. Other aspect, and I agree with the importance of a smarter, efficient immigration system, but I also believe that we can't just immigrate our way out of the skills problem, skill and labor shortage. We're working in investment in education, and has reiterated that we have some initiatives with post-secondary and continue to move down that road. But one of the elements that, as Mr. Julian alluded to, we had the ambassador from Chile here on Tuesday to our committee, and they talked about bilateral agreements. And Canada hasn't had a bilateral agreement since 2001. And I'm just wondering, I mean, Chile's had over 40. From your perspective, do you see any specific areas that we can concentrate on, what we can do to get out of that logjam?
Putting all of our eggs basically in the FTAA basket. We were hoping that a free trade area of the Americas would be the next step forward, and we would be able to build a regional trade agreement. And of course that collapsed for whatever reason 2 or 3 years ago. Part of the reason we put emerging markets up so high in the foreign policy agenda is because that's where global growth is happening. I mean, you ultimately, you have to follow, trade has to follow where the growth is happening, where the consumers are. And so I would look to countries like China and India, recognizing that it's going to be tough negotiating because those are very different cultures and economies at a very different stage of development. We put a lot of energy, I'll give you a counterexample, put a lot of energy into try and deepen our trade relationship with Europe and with the EU, and it's given us almost nothing. And much as I like the sense that Premier Charest brought to trying to re-energize trade with Europe last week, my fear is that we are really small potatoes compared to a European economy of 450 million people. Their interest is, of course, in the United States. So one lens we'll have to look through is whether it's bilateral or really it's going to be increasingly region-to-region negotiations. I would argue part of the reason we're pursuing Korea right now, for example, is because the Americans got there first, and they're talking to the Koreans about free trade as well. And we have to decide whether we're going to be Me Too's, trying to always catch up with what the Americans are doing, or are we prepared to really take the bold step forward and say we have to look at this as a North American regional engagement with Europe, with Asia.
Thank you, Mr. Cannon. Your time is up. We'll go now to Mr. Julian for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to come back, and I appreciate the economic theory that you're providing today. Of course, Canadians can't eat a theory, right? I want to come back to the issue of the quality of jobs, because what Statistics Canada tells us is from 1989 to 2004, those are the most recent figures available, that for the lower 60%, in other words, the first, second, and third quintile, over 60% of working families have actually seen their incomes fall in real terms. They're actually earning less money now than they were in 1989, before we started these free trade agreements and started to change, restructure the Canadian economy. The upper middle class has held its own barely, just barely hanging on. They basically have kept up with inflation. And then you've seen the wealthiest 20% of Canadians seeing their incomes absolutely skyrocket. So we're not talking about a situation, a theoretical situation where there have been some losers. Most Canadians are worse off than they were in 1989. They're working longer and longer hours. Overtime has gone up, as you know, by almost a third. And we're seeing that most of the jobs created in the economy today, Statistics Canada tells us, are part-time, temporary in nature, no benefits, no pensions. So we also see the quality of jobs being created currently, in the current economic context, as being jobs with a lot more precarity and jobs that don't provide the sort of family-sustaining incomes that we used to see in Canada. So my first question is around that issue of the quality of jobs. I'm looking through and trying to find a roadmap within your document that actually points to family-sustaining jobs. I don't see it yet. Perhaps I'm missing it, or perhaps it's in later studies. But how do you deal with the fact that we have gone through these various trade agreements and Canadians, most Canadians, are worse off than they were than when we began? And even though there generally tends to be from the corporate sector a siren call to let's just do more of the same and somehow magically it'll transform into a real equitable prosperity for all Canadians, I have doubts, because the reality is, on the bottom line, over the most recent figures that we have available since 1989, it hasn't worked. It's failed. That's my first question. My second question is around foreign investment. We've seen 11,000 takeovers in that 15-year period, 11,000, and they were all rubber-stamped. Liberals rubber-stamped them. Conservatives have rubber-stamped them. When is foreign investment not in Canadians' interests? Again, we're seeing a fall in real incomes for most Canadian families. 11,000 takeovers without a single real review. And then my third question is coming back to the agricultural sector, family farms. Countries that have the highest quality of life index, the Human Development Index, are countries that support their family farms. And here we have a real push by the Bush administration to destroy the Canadian Wheat Board, though farmers are pushing the government back on that, and to basically give up on supply management. Why should Canada give up on supply management in the Canadian Wheat Board when it serves our farmers very well and helps to support family farms and farming communities across the country? Those are my three questions. Thank you.
One thing is that I would link basically what we're seeing in terms of incomes to education. Basically, if you're looking at that, we have 40% of our population of labor force age that have low literacy skills. How can they compete in this new reality that we're facing? We have immigrants that have their credentials non-recognized and are underemployed for basically the skills that they have, and therefore earning lower incomes. There's a big link between the level of education and the level of incomes being generated. That's one thing. The other thing as well is that if you're looking at it in terms of the trends that we're seeing, and Glenn mentioned about the rise of global supply chains. In Canada, we still haven't found our place with respect to global supply chains and making sure that we can prosper within that new economic reality. We talk in our volume about Canadians being complacent on a number of fronts. And that complacency is affecting our productivity. If we could generate more productivity in Canada, we would also have higher incomes. And the productivity challenge is very much on some of those jobs which are lower paid as well. So there's a number of issues around that. One has to do with education, but also has to do with finding our niche within these global supply chains, and finally looking at it in terms of making sure that we can generate the type of jobs that we need. Linda, would you like to add anything?
Well, I think Jill picked up a lot of the points I was going to mention. We clearly acknowledge right up front that we're sliding within the OECD in aggregate, income as a income per capita, and the link we draw is to productivity. But as Jill just set out, we then analyze in much greater detail not the jobs per se, but the attributes of the populations behind. So you look at, as you said, the 40% of our workforce, which doesn't have the basic literacy skills to actually adapt, and that's where we talk about lifelong learning and the need for skill development in colleges and universities in the workplace. We actually call upon employers to invest a lot more money in retooling and educating their own workforce on an ongoing basis. We point to the Aboriginal population, and the numbers, frankly, are shocking. Aboriginal kids who get through high school live as well as we do. They have roughly the same life expectancies. Their incomes are not different than ours. But if they don't get through that gate, that grade 12 gate, they have a drastically worse life expectancy in every respect. So I don't think it's a matter of sort of capturing it simply in terms of the employment numbers. I think you also need to drill into the more micro factors. But your data is spot on, and that's exactly why we focused on sustainable prosperity, on productivity and competitiveness is such a key driver.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. Your time is up. We now go to the official opposition Liberal Party. Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Hodgson referenced the non-tariff trade barriers as being insidious with the United States. Our next bilateral agreement will probably be with Korea. And we've had strong representations before this committee from both labor and producers on their extreme concerns that if we enter into an agreement with Korea, it'll be a one-way street in the auto sector because of the non-tariff trade barriers. And given that the auto sector is such an important part of our economy, how do we protect ourselves against those non-tariff trade barriers? I mean, how can we sign an agreement until we have such protections, or at least an escape as well if in fact they throw them up and we can't respond?
Very valid question. It's an extremely valid question because we know, for example, I don't know Korea as well as I know Japan, but in Japan, the subtle things they use in terms of auto ownership, the fact that most people don't drive a car beyond year 6, you have safety inspections, there's also sorts of kind of little biases built in favor of consuming a Japanese automobile, so that penetration by cars fabricated in North America has been very, very slim over the years. I don't think I have an easy answer for you. I do think that we have to think very hard about whether we have two separate bilaterals. I mean, the Americans have already approached the Koreans, and whether Canada is a me too and goes along on our own separate track, or whether, frankly, we have to sit down and think very hard about Canada-U.S. as a team, effectively, protecting our collective interests and our engagement with Korea, because clearly America will have much more leverage in that relationship than we ever.
Certainly, Canada and U.S. are certainly integrated in the auto industry.
And in the auto industry in particular, there's complete and total integration, except for the challenge of getting stuff across the border unimpeded. And right now, of course, by virtue of things like a public healthcare system, we have a competitive advantage. That's probably the key driver, and plus the exchange rate in the past, but that's gone. But why are more cars made in Canada than the United States? Because the auto manufacturers save between $800 and $1,500 a car by doing the fabrication here. Well, that tells me that as a core strategy, if you're worried about that particular sector, we have to do it in alignment with the United States. Now, that takes us to very different places politically, and we understand that entirely. But in the world of realpolitik, it'll be hard for Canada to really pursue its own interests in Korea without the kind of leverage that our neighbor to the south has.
Well, the other thing about the automotive sector, we have the most efficient car assembly processes in Canada within the North American context. We're highly productive. One thing which is important has to do with what the auto industry has introduced in Canada last year, but what is called the Beacon Initiative. And the aspect is to find basically a way that our auto sector can become more innovative because of these global supply chains that are happening, and trying to make sure that we can thrive within that global auto sector. You know, assembling cars is one thing, designing them is another, and getting involved in terms of greater innovation in the automotive sector could be a key in competing not only in the North American context but worldwide. And that, I would say, should be a key strategy for Canada to be successful in that industry.
You also referenced the border and how we have to deal with some of the problems there. But how do you deal with the mindset that you have in the United States, where they're so paranoid about security that at one time we used to cross the land border by just identifying what country we were born in, and only those born in another country would produce a passport. Now they want not only Canadians but their own citizens returning to the country to produce passports. We have Nexus cards, smart cards, but you know, whenever we try to work something out, they always are putting up more barriers. And how do you deal with a mindset that is opposed to a free flow of services and people across the border?
No, we certainly don't have a silver bullet for all of that. Some of the advice we give in our report is investing more in pre-customs clearance away from the border, for example. Actually, I would think that having the federal government step up with the provinces and be seen as investing in more things that boost American confidence in our security, like smart intelligence, looking at trucks and various things like that.
But we have that now.
And that's the frustration, is that because it really is two solitudes to a great degree right now in a north-south context around security. We put all of our weight on economic interests, and they put all of their weight on security. And it is frustrating. I lead a team at the board that gives advice on tourism. We're one of the core forecasters on tourism to various players across the country. And the collapse of our tourist industry is very sad. It's been so quiet. It's a very atomistic industry spread across. We really don't notice the impact. But you're absolutely right to worry about the border, because the day travelers from the U.S. are simply not going to come. Not going to come to our casinos. Many of them will not go out and get a passport to make the trip. So it's a real point of concern. And yet there is no easy fix. There truly is not. I would presume we're going to fall back on standard diplomacy, constant representation, finding the key interested parties in Washington, being there, sort of friendly in their face all the time. But we haven't come up with a silver bullet by any means.
You indicated that we're small potatoes to Europe, and that they're looking at the U.S. market, of which you've indicated also that 83% of our trade is with the U.S. How do we protect ourselves from being squeezed out by European goods and services being replacing our goods and services that are going there now?
Great degree. Within Europe itself, we already have been squeezed out. We have a few charts in the report showing how little growth in exports we've had to Europe over the last, 10, 20, 15 years, and how our businesses had to resort to becoming European companies. So there clearly is a very subtle Fortress Europe barrier that goes around Europe, a lot of it non-tariff barriers. And companies who want to do business in Europe have to become European, meaning they have to invest in Europe to get inside that wall. The evidence of that is that sales from our affiliates in Europe are a multiple of our exports to Europe. In a country like the UK, I think it's 3.5 times. Canadian companies established through investment operating in Britain, their sales are triple what our exports are to Britain. How do we overcome it? Well, we tried. We've tried very, very hard to get European attention. We have something called the TIA, which is in place, where there's a dialogue between Canadian and European business, but it's going nowhere fast. And so I guess increasingly, and this is not in the report, but increasingly I think we have to really think hard about whether we can use the North American integration as a platform. Getting squeezed out, I would argue, has already happened. We've seen the deflection of investment away from North America. The Canadian share of investment, Jill, you actually did this research three years ago, but our share of external investment coming into North America has fallen progressively over 15 or 20 years. So the crowding out has already occurred. It's more a question, can we do anything to try and crowd ourselves back in?
Mr. Maloney. Your time is up. We now go to the Bloc Québécois. Monsieur Vincent, who is a member visiting from the Industry Committee. Welcome, and please proceed.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et bonjour.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. Yes, my colleagues have been kind enough to let me speak as well. From your experience, because you've been referring earlier to your experience in the area of international trade, what would be the three most important factors or elements that would explain why we are not so competitive with the States? I'm sorry, the three elements that explain why we are not so competitive with emerging states. Well, in our report, we are discussing competitiveness, but we're talking a lot about the low level of productivity in countries and in this country, and that causes us problems. Well, why? Well, we looked at some 13 factors, so there are many, but basically the most important ones are the barriers that we have here in Canada that prevent us from becoming more competitive, interprovincial barriers on the one hand, and there are also obstacles that we have with other countries that mean that there is less competitivity and we have less incentive to innovate and less incentive to try and do things differently. I was talking, for example, to a group of entrepreneurs in Sherbrooke who were talking about the increasing pressures from China. But they've become used to just dealing with the Americans and become accustomed to doing the same thing for years on end with the same technology. And that's no longer a strategy that can really meet our needs as a country. So for those kinds of people, business people, they look at China and they say, well, what should we do? So I think that's one reason why we need to have an investment in technology strategy and an innovation strategy, and also for the government to discuss the new opportunities in those markets. We did an analysis from that perspective in my innovation group, and we saw, for example, that there are all kinds of websites that these people can go and look at when they want to learn about new markets. But there are very few sort of interactive sites, very few interfaces that will connect these people to those markets. And it would be better to have that kind of innovation to help the small Canadian businesses and medium-sized businesses to accede to these markets. What do you think about intellectual property? Because I know very well that in terms of industry, or at the Industry Committee rather, we spoke for hours about products that have been developed, but other countries come with their own intellectual property and bring it to the Canadian market. They have lower costs that they're paying their employees, for example. So what do you think of that? Should there be legislation to protect intellectual property? Well, we already have that as such, but it doesn't prevent anyone from selling that copyright elsewhere. The issue is not to prevent this, but to stimulate activity here in Canada. We don't have an effective trade strategy. Well, and one thing before I come back to IP, some businesses said to us that it wasn't worth their spending thousands and thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars to convince Japanese countries to pay, to say that, listen, this is my product, I'm the one who developed this. They stole it anyway. So do you agree with that? Well, I don't know how you interpret stealing, but, well, they've appropriated it, let's say. Well, I think from that perspective, there is an agreement usually on the sale of that kind of intellectual property. No, but let's say you have a new product, you go to a trade show, There are other countries there. They take several photographs, buy your product, and from that make something very similar or almost the same, and then try and come sell it here. Well, now that's another issue. We've seen this, for example, particularly in developing countries. I wouldn't think Japan, but yes, China, for example. That is a huge problem on the international front. That intellectual property that, well, you can say stolen, but or it's copied, and there's no benefit to the person who did the original work. That's something we have to look at the level of international negotiations to try and protect that intellectual property. When we discuss commercial agreements with China and we have negotiations, there are pressures that we can bring to bear, I think, on that kind of point, and that might be something that we should raise. For example, when we look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, there were environmental issues and labor issues. Well, I understand that the Canadian government invests in research and development in industries, but what do you think about that same government taking these industries or taking people from these industries and on trade missions to China to show off the results of that R&D investment? Well, the goal of the missions, those missions, is to develop markets that don't currently exist, to sell those products rather than to see them copied. So, no, but I'm talking about the fruits of the R&D investments of the government, and you take these people, but then those people will end up producing what you've done. No, but that's part of the global production chain, you know. I'll tell you one thing. I'll give you an example. In textiles and clothing, if you look at the fabrics and the price of what you're paying is a result of this kind of trade, the people who make clothing make almost nothing. It's the person who designs it who makes it, and so I mean, really, there's no problem on that front. You have no problem with that, because at one point you were talking about brains and how people are mobile, but I mean, we'll find ourselves with a lack of workers if we don't increase our immigration, and we need this brain power. We're not going to need people to produce these things. Well, this is an issue of comparative advantages that exist in different countries. We can develop products, but they're not necessarily products that we even are going to sell in Canada. The design is what's important. The production can happen elsewhere.
Thank you. I'll be sharing my time with my colleague. I just wanted to ask a question. We spoke about exporting. We also want investment in Canada. We're talking about trying to improve border access, border crossings, make it more seamless. I know we're looking down in the Windsor area at improvements that we can make there, but the government's also made a huge announcement about investing in the Pacific Gateway. I don't know whether you've had the opportunity to look at the Pacific Gateway and what sort of opportunities this might bring to Canada. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that, on what you see that doing for Canada.
Well, at this time yesterday morning, I was sitting looking out the window at the Pacific Gateway because I was in Vancouver, and I actually had a discussion very much like that with 3 or 4 players, people who are doing analysis of the BC economy, Pacific Gateway. And I guess the question I have is whether it's big enough, is adequacy. There's a huge debate about Prince Rupert and whether there's actual economic viability of expanding. But I think the really critical question is, will Vancouver and the Pacific Gateway flowing across the national economy be of sufficient scale to attract our fair share of the trade compared to Long Beach, compared to Portland, compared to the expansion of Mexican ports? So that's one level. The other risk, however, is what happened with the information superhighway. Are we all going to make a massive investment and end up with double the capacity we actually need on an ongoing basis? So I think there's a real scope for some debate around that. But fundamentally, if we're going to attract our fair share, we have to make sure the investment is adequate. And of course, the true investment being made there is far beyond what the federal government's announced. The provincial government's invested billions of dollars. Private sector will too. One of the things we would like to see happen, in fact, is let's extend it across and see how we can actually build the entire linkage for things like cross-shipment of containers and taking some of the capacity away from the port to ensure that we can become a gateway across the entire North American economy. But a great question to ask, and I guess our question mark at the end of the day is it actually big enough? Because there's no doubt in our mind that the investment has to happen. Otherwise, trade will be diverted to Long Beach and Portland and all the ports along the West Coast, including the expansion of Panama. The Panama Canal expansion offers another alternative.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to start off by saying that I'm going to disagree with my good friend over there from the NDP in terms of what free trade has done in terms of real salaries, and I understand that they have gone down. My thought is that we're overtaxed and we're not as productive, and there's all those other things going on as a reason for that. In human resources right now, we're doing a study of employability, and certainly all the issues you've touched upon in terms of literacy. We've got a great educated workforce that have come in from across around the world, but are not necessarily literate and not able to always produce foreign credentials and all these other things. Could you touch a bit? I know you don't talk about the Irish experience, but my thoughts are in terms of productivity here in Canada. I mean, you've touched on these already, but some of the things that made a big difference over there were not just cutting taxes, but the educated workforce, people returning home, infrastructure, and all these other kinds of things. And we could spend 10 minutes. I'm only allowed 3 minutes, so that's my only question, the only time I have. Talk about that in terms of addressing the issue of rising salaries and some of these other things, and the experience in Ireland, and how we could benefit from that.
Do you want to talk Ireland, or shall I? Well, I think there's actually a high degree of convergence amongst economic analysts on what's required to have an effective productivity strategy for a country to actually create sustained wealth. And you touched on it. You have to be tax competitive. You have to invest in your people. You have to have your infrastructure working well. All the pieces we've touched in our report. The one thing that Ireland had, which we will not have, is it became a gateway for foreign investment into Europe. It obviously also had subsidies from the EU for its farm community. And we can't duplicate that. We're not going to attract a disproportionate share of investment into North America, but we would like to capture our fair share. So the Irish case is interesting, as is the case of Singapore and some other really high-performing global economies. Iceland right now, little Iceland, spectacular productivity growth rates. We can't replicate it, but we can learn what the key elements are. And I think we've done a pretty good job of setting them out by articulating the need to have a national strategy around competitiveness and productivity, and then pointing to national market, education, and the role of investment and trade and ultimately foreign policy in supporting that.
You have something to add?
Yeah, there's an interesting thing about Ireland. If you're looking at that from the late 80s, 1990, the income per capita in Ireland was about 50% the Canadian average. Now it surpasses the Canadian average. Yeah. Point number one. Point number two is that they focused. They had a niche strategy. We don't. They looked and they saying we're going to focus on two things: information and communications technology and biotechnology. And that's where they attracted the investment. That's where they attracted the top talent, and this is why they're successful among the basic business environment. We have to develop niche strategies for Canada, which we don't have.
And that's where Gilles and I would probably differ from some other economists who would say, let the market decide. The truth is governments have finite resources, and every day we're taking priority-setting decisions. We're going to give more money for this, but we're not going to give it for that. We think we have to bring the same mindset to development of sectors without picking winners, without picking individual firms or even individual subsectors, but really creating the conditions and identify the races where we're really equipped to run.
Priorities, and like I said, it's the report's excellent. We appreciate seeing the next couple of reports coming down. Thanks.
I think we just have a couple of minutes left. Mr. Julian, do you want to ask a short question, or should we just close?
I have no further questions, but perhaps one of my colleagues, Mr. LeBlanc and Mr. Beans.
Yeah, no, we're almost out of time anyway. It would be one short question. So I'd just like to thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a fascinating discussion. I'm looking forward to part 2 next week. and I'm sure it'll be equally as interesting. It's a fascinating study you've done, extremely worthwhile, very informative. So just thank you very much, gentlemen. See you again. Meeting adjourned.